How one mechanic's stupid wire trick made the Supermarine Spitfire beat every zero. He was no ace, no medals, no headlines, just oil on his hands and a wire coil in his pocket. George Hammond stood in the shadow of a Supermarine Spitfire, its aluminum skin cold under the gray English sky. Around him, the hangar echoed with rivets and shouting. No one noticed the young mechanic kneeling beside the aircraft's control linkage, studying something the engineers had already dismissed. In a war obsessed with speed and glory, George saw what others couldn't, a flaw in the machine everyone worshipped. He twisted a length of steel wire, barely thicker than a matchstick, into a loop. Every engineer who glanced at it called it stupid. A waste of time. Amateur thinking. But when the next mission launched over Burma, that same wire would stop wings from locking, save pilots mid-dive, and turn Britain's fragile hope into legend. This is the story of the idea no one believed in, until it started saving lives. The war had been grinding for 3 years. Factories strained, replacement parts arrived late or not at all. The Spitfire, Britain's darling, its symbol of defiance, was showing cracks under the pressure of constant combat. George Hammond was 23 years old. He'd grown up fixing tractors on a farm in Somerset, and when the war came, they put him in a hangar instead of a cockpit. Fine by him. He understood machines better than he understood people. The other mechanics tolerated him. The engineers barely knew his name. But George noticed things. He noticed that when Spitfires returned from high-altitude intercepts, pilots complained about control stiffness. He noticed that during steep dives, when every second mattered, the control cables would vibrate, sometimes freeze entirely, leaving the aircraft unresponsive for critical moments. And he noticed that no one seemed to care. "It's thermal expansion," one engineer said, waving him off. "Tolerances shift at altitude." "Nothing to be done. Maybe cable tension?" George suggested quietly. "Cable tension is factory spec. You think Supermarine doesn't know what they're doing?" George didn't answer, but late at night, after the officers left and the hangar fell quiet except for the rain drumming on the corrugated roof, he stayed behind. He studied the control runs, the cables that connected the stick to the ailerons and elevators. He measured slack. He traced the path from cockpit to wing, and then he found it. Under high G-forces, the cables stretched microscopically. Just enough that when combined with temperature drops at 20,000 feet, the tension wavered. The control surfaces didn't respond cleanly. Pilots had to muscle through it. George pulled a length of scrap steel wire from a bin. He twisted it into a small coil, then looped it around a section of the control cable near the wing root. A simple tensioner that would absorb vibration and maintain consistent pressure. It took him 15 minutes. The next morning, he showed it to the senior engineer. The man laughed. Actually laughed. "You think that," he pointed at the wire coil, "is going to solve control cable dynamics that Supermarine's best engineers have already accounted for? It's stupid, Hammond. It'll snap before it saves anyone." Another mechanic walked by, glanced over. "What's that, George? Making jewelry now?" The hangar filled with chuckles. George felt his face flush. He pocketed the wire and went back to work. But that night, when no one was watching, he installed it on one aircraft, Spitfire MB-27. He tightened the coil, checked the tension 3 times, and walked away before anyone could ask questions. The next morning, Flight Lieutenant Peter Davies climbed into MB-27 without knowing a thing about the wire. George couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, listening to the other men snore, imagining the wire snapping mid-flight, imagining Davies losing control, imagining the investigators finding the unauthorized modification and tracing it back to him. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was stupid. He wrote a letter home to his mother that week. He didn't mention the wire. He never mentioned the technical work, But he wrote, "Sometimes I think I see things that aren't there. Maybe I'm daft. Maybe I should just keep my head down." But he didn't keep his head down, because on the fourth day, Davies came back from a sortie and said something strange during debrief. "Controls felt tighter," he told the flight commander. "Cleaner response in the dive. Don't know why." George was wiping down a fuselage nearby. His hand froze on the rag. Another mechanic, an older man named Bertie, overheard. Later, Bertie pulled George aside. "Did you do something to—" George hesitated. "Just check the tension." Bertie studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Whatever you did, do it again." But the supervisor, a rigid man named Thompson, noticed George working late too often. Noticed him lingering near control assemblies. "Hammond." George turned. Thompson stood with his arms crossed, clipboard in hand. "I've been told you're making unauthorized modifications." You're just doing what you're told. That's your job. You want to redesign Spitfires, go work for Supermarine. Here you follow procedure." George's jaw tightened. "The pilots are complaining. The pilots complain about everything. Your job is maintenance, not innovation. Clear?" "Sir." But that night, George stood in the empty hangar, rain hammering the roof. He stared at Spitfire WWII X-11 Fort, scheduled for Burma the next week. He thought about Davies, about the pilots who'd never come back, about the Japanese Zeros, nimble, deadly, able to outturn a Spitfire in a dogfight. He thought about the wire coil in his pocket, and then, breath-heavy, heart-pounding, he installed it on JX-11 Fort. He checked the knot again and walked away. The next morning, the squadron was briefed for deployment to the Far East. "Expect Zeros over Burma," the intelligence officer said. "They'll be faster in the turn. Your advantage is the dive. Use it." Flight Lieutenant Sarah Winters, one of the few women flying combat sorties, would take JX-114. George watched from the tarmac as she taxied out. He didn't pray, but he held his breath. The sky above Rangoon was blinding blue, empty except for the sun and 6 Spitfires in loose formation. Sarah Winters flew JX-1114 at 18,000 feet, eyes scanning. The radio crackled with routine chatter. Then, "Bandits, 2 o'clock high." She snapped her head right, 5 Zeros diving fast. Her heartbeat spiked. She pushed the stick forward, rolling into a defensive break. The Spitfire screamed downward. Altitude bled away. 15,000, 12,000. The controls vibrated in her hands. She pulled tighter, forcing the dive steeper. And then nothing. No stiffness. No lag. The stick responded clean, immediate. The ailerons bit into the air like they'd never done before. She blinked. What the? A Zero flashed past her canopy, unable to follow the dive angle. She pulled hard left, harder than she'd ever dared, and the Spitfire obeyed instantly. Another Zero tried to track her. She snap-rolled, pulled vertical, and the enemy fighter overshot. Her breath came fast. "Controls holding," she muttered into the radio. "How is it holding?" She'd flown Spitfires for 18 months. She knew what they felt like in a fight. This wasn't normal. This was better. She rolled onto the tail of the second Zero, lined up, fired, tracer rounds stitched across its wing. The enemy aircraft shuddered, belched smoke, and spun away. "Splash 1," someone shouted on the radio. Sarah pulled out of the dive at 4,000 feet, breathing hard, sweat stinging her eyes. The controls were still perfect. George Hammond sat on an overturned crate outside the hangar, listening to the shortwave radio someone had rigged up to catch transmissions from the Far East. The voices were faint, crackling through static. Controls holding firm. Never felt it respond like this. George's hands shook. He dropped the wrench he'd been holding. Bertie walked over, squinted at him. "You all right?" George nodded, but he couldn't speak. The dogfight lasted 12 minutes. When it ended, 4 zeros were down. No Spitfires lost. In the debrief tent, Sarah Winters stood in front of the squadron leader, still in her flight suit, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. The aircraft performed beyond spec, she said. I don't know why, but JX-1114 gave me control authority I've never had before. The engineering officer frowned. We'll inspect it. They did. They found the wire coil. They logged it as field modification. Structural reinforcement. No name attached. The modification was quietly adopted. Not with fanfare, not with official directives, but word spread among mechanics. The wire coil Hammond's trick, some called it, started appearing on Spitfires across the fleet. Pilots noticed survival rates in high-G maneuvers improved. The Spitfire, already legendary, became something more reliable in the moments that mattered most. One evening, Sarah Winters returned to England on rotation. She made a point to visit the maintenance hangar. She found George wiping down an aileron. You, Hammond? He looked up, startled. Yes, ma'am. She studied him for a moment. They tell me you're the one who modified JX-1114. George swallowed. Yes, I did. She held out her hand. He shook it, confused. That wire saved my life, she said quietly. I don't care what they call it. I know what it did. George felt something tighten in his chest. He nodded, unable to find words. Thank you, she said. And then she walked away. Thompson, the supervisor, never apologized. But he stopped questioning George. And when the official report came down crediting improved maintenance protocols for the performance gains, George didn't correct anyone. He hung the leftover coil of wire on the workshop wall above his birdie sod and smiled. Trophy? Reminder? George said, that sometimes brilliance sounds like nonsense until it works. An elderly woman stood in the Imperial War Museum studying a photograph on the wall. It showed a young mechanic kneeling beside a Spitfire, tools in hand. The caption read, Unknown Mechanic, RAF Maintenance Crew, 1942. The woman leaned closer. She'd flown Spitfires in Burma. She'd survived because of someone whose name she'd learned once and never forgotten. Beside the photograph, encased in glass, was a small coil of steel wire. The plaque beside it read, Field Modification Origin Unknown. Improved control response under high-G maneuvers. Credited with saving countless lives. The woman smiled. Wars end. Medals tarnish. Names fade from record. But the echo of one small idea twisted from scrap wire in a cold hangar by a young man no one believed in outlasted them all. They called it stupid. History called it essential.